I used to believe that love meant being seen, but I learned the truth the day I realized I could stand right in front of my husband and still be completely invisible. That was the beginning of everything I lost. My name is Sophia Carter, and 5 years ago I was married to a man the world called a rising CEO, a man who built companies, closed billion-dollar deals, and appeared on magazine covers as an example of discipline and control. To the outside world, Ethan Blake was everything success was supposed to look like. At home, he was something else entirely, or perhaps more accurately, he was nothing at all. I was 26 when I found out I was pregnant. I remember the exact moment, standing in a bathroom with trembling hands, staring at a small test that changed the entire shape of my future. For a moment I thought it would bring us closer, that it would soften the distance growing between us, that maybe a child would remind him I was still here, still waiting, still hoping. But the distance did not close. It only became more obvious. Ethan stopped asking about my day. He stopped noticing when I entered rooms. He stopped looking at me the way a husband is supposed to look at his wife. At first I told myself it was stress, work pressure, the demands of his position as CEO of Blake Enterprises, a company that seemed to consume every hour of his life. I adjusted. I made excuses. I learned how to speak less, so I would not feel the silence echoing back at me. I told myself that marriage was not about constant attention, that love could still exist quietly in the background. But pregnancy changes how you notice things. It sharpens everything. It makes waiting feel longer. It makes silence feel heavier. I remember one evening sitting alone in our dining room, watching the empty chair across from me as dinner went cold. I had spent the afternoon hoping he would come home early. He did not. When he finally walked in hours later, he barely acknowledged my presence. I said his name once, softly, and he responded without turning his head, as if my voice was coming from another room entirely. That was the moment something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Over the following weeks I tried again. I told him about doctor appointments. I told him about the baby moving for the first time. I even showed him the ultrasound photo, holding it out like an offering. He glanced at it for less than a second before returning to his phone. There was no cruelty in his actions. That was what made it worse. There was only absence. I began to understand that being ignored does not always look like rejection. Sometimes it looks like someone simply forgetting you exist while you are still standing in front of them. As my pregnancy progressed, I started feeling less like a wife and more like a shadow moving through a life that no longer responded to me. The house was large, beautifully designed, filled with things that should have represented comfort, but every room felt like it belonged to someone else. Even the air felt different when Ethan was present, as if it tightened around him and left no space for anything else. I would sit by the window for hours, watching the city move beneath us, wondering when I had become so unimportant in a life I had once believed I was part of. I told myself I would wait until things changed. I told myself that people like him eventually notice what matters. But there are moments in life when waiting becomes indistinguishable from disappearing. And slowly, without realizing it at first, I began to understand that I was no longer waiting to be seen. I was preparing to leave. I remember the exact moment I realized silence in a marriage can be louder than arguments. It was not during a fight because Ethan Blake and I rarely fought. It was during the absence of everything that should have been there. No questions about how I felt. No curiosity about the life growing inside me. No shared anticipation. Just distance, stretching longer every day like an invisible wall neither of us acknowledged out loud. After that first shift I felt inside me, I started noticing details I had ignored before. The way Ethan would walk past me in the hallway without stopping. The way his phone always seemed more important than any sentence I tried to begin. The way he would sit across from me at dinner and treat the space between us like it belonged to someone else. First I thought it was stress. I even convinced myself it was responsibility, the weight of running Blake Enterprises, a company that demanded everything from him. I told myself that successful men sometimes forget the world outside their goals. I wanted to believe that because believing anything else meant accepting something I was not ready to face. But pregnancy has a way of stripping illusions slowly. Every appointment I attended alone made the truth heavier. Every night I lay awake feeling the baby move inside me while the person who should have been there slept in another room made it clearer that I was carrying this life alone, even though I was still technically married. I stopped asking him to come with me after the third appointment. Not because I stopped needing him, but because I stopped expecting him to come. I remember sitting in the doctor's office one afternoon, holding my phone and staring at it longer than I should have, wondering if I should call him just to hear his voice. I did not. Something inside me already knew what the answer would be, even before I heard it. That was the beginning of my quiet separation, long before I physically left. I started preparing in ways that did not look like preparation. I saved small amounts of money without telling anyone. I began organizing documents I might need one day. I thought about places I could go that did not belong to him. Every action felt small on its own, but together they formed something I did not yet have a name for. Then came the night I stopped waiting. Ethan came home later than usual. I was sitting in the living room when he walked past me, his attention already elsewhere. I said his name just once, and he paused only briefly before continuing toward his office. That was when I understood something simple but irreversible. I was not part of his world anymore. I was only occupying space inside it. I went upstairs after that and stood in front of the mirror for a long time, looking at a version of myself I barely recognized. I was still pregnant, still his wife on paper, still living in a house that looked perfect from the outside, but none of it felt like mine anymore. I did not cry immediately. I think I had already cried in smaller ways over the weeks before that moment, until there was nothing left that needed to fall apart loudly. Instead, I made a decision. Not dramatic, not emotional, just final. I packed one suitcase that night while the house was quiet. I did not leave a note. I did not confront him. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said through absence. When I left the house, the air outside felt colder than I expected, but for the first time in months, I could breathe without feeling watched by silence. I walked away carrying everything that mattered inside me, and nothing else. I did not know where I was going yet. I only knew I could not stay where I had become invisible. I did not know where I was going when I left Ethan Blake's house, but I knew exactly where I could not return. That distinction became the only thing keeping me moving forward. The night air in Chicago felt sharper than I remembered, cutting through my coat as I walked without direction, suitcase wheels uneven against the sidewalk. Every few steps reminded me that I had just removed myself from a life that had defined me for years, even if that life had slowly erased me in return. I checked my phone once, then again, then stopped checking it altogether. There were no messages. Not from Ethan. Not from anyone who had ever claimed to care where I ended up. That silence should have hurt more than it did. Instead, it felt expected, like confirmation of a truth I had already accepted before I ever left. I ended up sitting near a small late-night cafe because it was the only place still open that did not ask questions when I walked in. I did not order much. I only needed somewhere to exist for a moment without being noticed. I remember staring at my reflection in the window again, realizing how quickly a person can disappear from their own life while still physically remaining inside it. That was when I felt the first real wave of uncertainty about what came next. Not regret. Not fear. Something closer to emptiness. I placed a hand lightly on my stomach without thinking, a reminder that my situation was no longer just about me. There was another life now, one that did not care about emotional collapse or broken relationships. It only cared about survival. I stayed there for what might have been an hour, maybe longer, until the cafe lights shifted slightly and the city outside grew quieter. I considered calling anyone, but the list in my mind kept shrinking until there was no one left who would answer in a way that mattered. That was when I remembered a place I had once seen briefly during a meeting Ethan had taken me to months ago. A small rental unit mentioned in passing by someone from his company. I had not thought about it since then, but now it returned with strange clarity. It was not ideal. It was not even close. But it was available, and more importantly, it was not his. I left the cafe and took a bus across the city, watching neighborhoods shift from bright commercial districts to quieter residential streets. By the time I arrived, the building looked smaller than I remembered, worn around the edges, but real in a way nothing else had felt that day. The landlord barely looked up when I asked for the unit. No questions, no hesitation, just a set of keys placed into my hand like this kind of transaction happened every day. Inside, the apartment was simple. Clean enough, empty enough, and silent enough to feel unfamiliar. I stood in the middle of the room for a long time before setting my suitcase down. There were no luxury finishes, no distant skyline views, no curated silence like Ethan's world. Just space, raw and unfiltered. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed myself to breathe in a way I had not been able to for weeks. The realization did not come all at once. Came slowly in pieces. I had left a marriage, a home, and a version of myself that no longer existed. But I had also left something else behind. The version of me that waited to be seen by someone who had already decided not to look. And for the first time since everything began, I understood that leaving was not the end of my story. It was the first step in reclaiming it. I did not sleep that night even. After I convinced myself I would. The small apartment I had rented felt unfamiliar in a way that was not uncomfortable, but unsettled, like I was temporarily borrowing a life that had not fully accepted me yet. I lay on the bed listening to the quiet hum of the city outside the thin walls, realizing how different silence feels when it is no longer filled with someone else's absence. In Ethan Blake's house, silence had been heavy because it came from neglect. Here silence felt empty because it was new. I kept thinking about the same question over and over again. What happens next when you leave a life that no longer includes you? There was no answer that came easily. Only time passing. Only breath. Only the faint awareness of a future that had not yet decided its shape. The next morning arrived without ceremony. No schedule, no obligations, no one asking where I was or when I would return. I stood in the small kitchen area staring at a single cup of coffee I had made myself, realizing how strange it felt to not be invisible inside someone else's routine. I had nothing planned for the day, but survival has its own structure when everything else falls away. I began unpacking slowly, not because I was organized, but because I needed to feel like I still had ownership over something, even if it was just clothing folded into a drawer. Around midday, I received a call from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. There was a pause on the other end before a familiar voice spoke, calm and controlled in a way that immediately made me straighten without realizing it. "Miss Carter," a man said. "My name is Daniel Reeves. I work with Blake Enterprises." My hand tightened slightly around the phone at the mention of Ethan's company. I had not expected anything from that world to reach me again so soon. "I am calling on behalf of a scheduled review regarding your previous employment records," he continued. "There are documents that require your confirmation." I almost laughed at the word confirmation. There was nothing left for me to confirm about a place that had already removed me without hesitation. "I do not work there anymore," I said quietly. "Yes," he replied, "but there are matters connected to your termination that have been flagged for further review." That sentence alone made my attention shift. "Flagged by whom?" I asked. A brief silence followed, the kind that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. "By executive oversight," he finally said. "And at your request, Mr. Blake has authorized direct communication." The name hit differently this time. Not as memory but as intrusion. Ethan Blake was not just part of my past. He was still capable of reaching into my present without stepping into the room. I did not respond immediately. My mind was already moving faster than I could process. "Why would he be involved in this?" I asked. Another pause. "Because your case is no longer considered routine," Daniel said. "There are inconsistencies that require clarification." I ended the call shortly after that, not because I had answers, but because I did not trust the direction those answers were beginning to point toward. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall without seeing it. I had left Ethan's world believing distance meant separation, that leaving physically would also mean leaving the structure behind. But for the first time since I walked away, I began to understand something I had not considered before. Some lives do not let you leave cleanly. Some connections do not end just because you decide they should. And somewhere inside that realization, a quiet question formed that I was not ready to answer. Why would Ethan Blake still be watching a life he had already stopped acknowledging? I told myself I would not answer another unknown number again, but the silence in my apartment made every decision feel louder than it should have been. After the call from Blake Enterprises, I kept replaying the words in my mind, not because they were confusing, but because they were carefully chosen. Nothing about it sounded accidental. Nothing about it sounded casual. It felt structured, like someone had already decided how the conversation should unfold before it ever reached me. I stood by the window for a long time that afternoon, watching people move through the street below as if their lives were simple and uninterrupted. It made me realize how far removed I felt from that kind of certainty. My world no longer had clear edges. Everything felt like it was being quietly reshaped without my permission. I tried to focus on small things to ground myself. I cleaned the kitchen counter twice. I folded clothes I had already folded. I made lists I did not need. Anything to keep my thoughts from circling back to Ethan Blake and the name that kept resurfacing in places it did not belong anymore. By evening, I convinced myself that I would not engage further. Whatever was happening inside his company was no longer my responsibility. I had left that life behind. I had made that choice clearly, even if the consequences were now refusing to stay behind me. But just after nightfall, another message arrived. This time it was not a call. It was an email. No subject line that felt personal. No greeting that suggested familiarity. Just formal language and a single attachment marked as urgent review documentation. I hesitated before opening it, my fingers hovering over the screen longer than necessary. I told myself I could close it immediately if it felt wrong. I told myself I still had control over what I chose to see. When I opened it, the first thing I noticed was my name. Not in a personal way, but in a structured report format that listed timelines, employment history, and decision notes. My stomach tightened as I read further. There were references to performance evaluations I had never seen before, internal comments attached to my file that I had never been informed about, and annotations that suggested ongoing review even after my termination. I leaned closer to the screen, my breathing slowing without intention. It was not just documentation. It felt like observation extended over time. At the bottom of the file, there was a section labeled Executive Review Authorization. Under it, one name appeared. Ethan Blake. I stared at it for a long moment, waiting for my mind to offer some alternative explanation. It did not. Instead, it began assembling patterns I had ignored before. The timing of the apartment. The speed of my job termination. The quiet efficiency of every transition that had carried me from his world into isolation. I closed the laptop quickly, but the image stayed behind my eyes. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water I did not drink. My hands were steady, but only because I had not yet decided what emotion was appropriate. Anger did not feel complete. Confusion did not feel strong enough. There was something else underneath both of them, something heavier that I could not yet define. I sat down at the small table in the center of the room and tried to reconstruct everything I knew about my marriage, as if it were a timeline I had misunderstood. I thought about how little Ethan had ever said during the final months. I thought about how quickly things had shifted after I told him I was pregnant. I thought about how easily I had been removed from his daily attention, as if I had simply become irrelevant rather than actively excluded. None of it felt random anymore. That realization did not come with clarity. It came with discomfort. I picked up my phone again, hesitating before scrolling back to the number that had called earlier. My thumb hovered over it for several seconds. I did not call back. Instead, I set the phone down and looked around the small apartment that was supposed to be my beginning again. It suddenly felt less like an escape and more like a pause between two versions of a story I had not fully been told. And somewhere deep inside that uncertainty, one thought returned again and again, growing louder each time I tried to ignore it. If Ethan Blake was still connected to my life in ways I could not see, then leaving him had never been the end of anything at all. I did not sleep that night, but not because I was afraid of what I had read. It was because my mind refused to stop reorganizing everything I thought I understood about my past with Ethan Blake. The apartment around me felt quieter than usual, almost too still, as if it was waiting for me to decide what kind of person I was becoming inside it. I sat at the small table long after midnight, staring at nothing in particular, replaying the documents I had seen over and over again until the details began to blur into something heavier than simple information. There was a difference between being ignored and being observed without consent. I was beginning to understand that difference too clearly. By morning, I felt less like someone recovering from a broken marriage, and more like someone standing inside a system she had never been fully removed from. I tried to go through normal routines anyway. I washed my face. I made coffee. I opened the window even though the air outside was cold. I told myself that distance meant freedom, that whatever Ethan Blake had been involved in no longer had the right to define my decisions. But that belief felt thinner than it had the day before. Around midday, I received another message. This time it was not indirect. It was a direct invitation. The subject line simply read review discussion scheduled. No explanation. No context beyond a time and location. A conference space downtown, connected to Blake Enterprises. My first instinct was to ignore it completely. I sat there for several minutes with my phone in my hand, weighing the idea of cutting every remaining thread cleanly. But then I thought about Noah. Not as a distant possibility, but as something real that I could not afford to leave unresolved. If there was even a chance that my son's existence was part of whatever was being reviewed, then silence was no longer an option. I arrived at the building later that afternoon. Blake Enterprises towered above the street like it had never stopped belonging to Ethan Blake, no matter what personal decisions had been made outside of it. The lobby was unchanged. Clean surfaces. Controlled movement. People walking with purpose as if nothing in their lives had ever been interrupted. When I gave my name at reception, I was escorted upward without hesitation. That alone told me everything I needed to know about how prepared they were for my arrival. The conference room was not crowded, but it felt heavy with expectation. A long table, glass walls, city skyline stretching endlessly behind it, and at the far end Ethan Blake. He stood when I entered, but only slightly, as if unsure whether formality still applied between us. For a moment neither of us spoke. I noticed immediately that his expression had changed from what I remembered. Not softer, not harsher, more focused, like he was trying to solve something that had remained unresolved for far too long. I sat down without waiting for permission. My hands were steady, but only because I refused to let them betray anything else. A man beside him began speaking, something about documentation, clarification, and final verification of records. I barely heard him. My attention kept returning to Ethan. Not the version of him I had left behind, but the version of him sitting across from me now, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment without ever admitting it. When the man finished speaking, silence filled the room again. Ethan finally looked directly at me. There was no hesitation in his voice when he spoke. "You are not supposed to be outside of this process," he said quietly. I felt my chest tighten at the word process. "I am not part of any process," I replied. His gaze did not move. "You were never removed completely," he said. "Only relocated." The word landed differently than anything else I had heard so far. Not because it was comforting, but because it implied intention. I leaned forward slightly, unable to keep still anymore. "Why?" I asked, my voice lower now. "Would you relocate my life without telling me?" Ethan did not answer immediately. When he finally did, his voice was steady in a way that made it impossible to dismiss. "Because you were not meant to disappear," he said. "You were meant to continue under different conditions." The room felt smaller after that sentence. I looked at him for a long moment, searching for anything that resembled uncertainty. There was none. Only certainty. Controlled, deliberate, and absolute. And for the first time since leaving his house, I realized the most unsettling possibility was not that I had been forgotten. It was that I had never truly been released at all. I left the conference room thinking the silence behind me would feel lighter once I stepped out, but it did not. It followed me into the hallway, into the elevator, into every breath I tried to take without shaking. Ethan Blake's words kept repeating in my mind, not because they were emotional, but because they were structured with a certainty I could not easily dismiss. "Relocated," he had said, as if my life had been moved from one controlled space to another without my awareness. I pressed my hand against the elevator wall as I descended, trying to steady myself, but the feeling only deepened. When I reached the street, the noise of the city should have helped, but it only made my thoughts louder. I kept asking myself the same question without finding a version of it that made sense. If I had been relocated instead of released, then what exactly had my leaving meant? That night, I did not return home immediately. I walked instead, moving through streets that felt unfamiliar even though I had lived in this city for years. Every block felt like a transition between versions of my life I no longer fully understood. I thought about Noah as I walked, not just as my child, but as a reality that now existed inside something larger than my own choices. I had left Ethan believing I was protecting myself and my son from emotional absence. But now I was beginning to question whether absence had ever truly been absence at all. It felt more like distance that had been measured. Not accidental space but deliberate separation. When I finally returned to the apartment, the lights were still off. I sat on the edge of the bed without turning anything on, letting the darkness settle around me instead of fighting it. My phone remained untouched on the table, even though I knew it would eventually light up again with messages I did not want to read. I kept thinking about Ethan's face when he said I was not meant to disappear. There had been no hesitation in his voice, no emotional struggle, only certainty. That certainty frightened me more than anything else, because it suggested that my life had never stopped being part of something he understood, even when I did not. The next morning I woke earlier than usual, not because I had slept well, but because my mind refused to rest any longer. I made coffee again, but this time I did not sit down immediately. I stood by the window and watched the city wake up beneath me, wondering how many other lives were moving inside systems they did not recognize. Around mid-morning, a delivery arrived at my door. No return address, no explanation. Just a sealed envelope. My hands hesitated before opening it. Inside was a printed document, not long but precise. It contained updated information about custody considerations, legal review notes, and administrative references to Noah's registration under both names. My breathing slowed as I read each line more carefully than the last. There was no emotional language. No interpretación. Only structure. At the bottom of the page, a single line stood out more than the rest. Ongoing oversight remains in effect pending full resolution of parental status alignment. I set the paper down slowly, my fingers no longer steady. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not memory or coincidence. This was continuation. And for the first time since leaving Ethan Blake, I understood that walking away had not ended the system I thought I escaped. It had only changed the way I was being observed inside it. I did not open the document again that night, even though it sat on my table like it was waiting for permission to change my entire understanding of reality. I already knew what it contained, and that was the most unsettling part. It was not surprise that I was feeling. It was recognition. The sense that every line I had read earlier was not new information, but confirmation of something that had already been quietly forming in the background of my life for years without my awareness. I sat in silence for a long time, my hands resting on the edge of the table, staring at nothing in particular. The apartment felt different now, not because anything in it had changed, but because I had changed the way I experienced it. Even the quiet felt like it had context I could no longer ignore. I kept thinking about Noah. About how a child's existence could be placed inside systems and documentation that existed completely outside of emotional language. That thought alone made everything feel heavier. Not because it was frightening, but because it was permanent. Later that afternoon, I received another message. This one was not an email or a formal document. It was a direct request for a meeting, marked as urgent but without explanation. The location was the same building as before. Blake Enterprises. I stared at it for a long time without responding. Part of me wanted to refuse completely, to sever whatever remaining connection existed between me and that world. But another part of me understood something I did not want to admit. Ignoring it would not make it disappear. It would only delay whatever resolution was already in motion. I arrived at the building just before sunset. The lobby felt unchanged, as if nothing in my life had ever shifted the way it had for me. People moved with the same efficiency, the same controlled focus, as if every action had already been accounted for in advance. When I stepped into the elevator, I realized my hands were steady, but only because I had reached a point where fear no longer had a clear direction. It had become something broader, harder to define. When I entered the meeting room, Ethan Blake was already there. He did not stand this time. He only looked at me as I entered, his expression unreadable in the same way it always had been, except now I understood that unreadable did not mean empty. It meant contained, controlled, intentional. I sat down without speaking. There was no need for formalities anymore. Whatever we were inside this moment was no longer a marriage or a separation, or even a negotiation in the traditional sense. It was something still forming, still unfolding. Ethan placed a folder on the table between us, but did not slide it toward me immediately. Instead, he spoke first. "You received the documentation," he said. It was not a question. I nodded once. My voice felt unnecessary at that moment. He studied me for a brief pause before continuing. Then you understand why this cannot remain unresolved, he said. I finally looked directly at him. Unresolved for who? I asked quietly. There was a long silence before he answered. For all parties connected to Noah, he said. The name landed in the center of the room like a fixed point that everything else rotated around. I felt my chest tighten, but I did not look away. You are talking about him like a case file, I said. Ethan did not react immediately. When he did, his voice remained steady. I am talking about him like responsibility, he replied. That distinction should have comforted me. It did not. Instead, it clarified something I had been avoiding. This was not about memory or regret. It was about structure, systems, definitions that existed whether I accepted them or not. I leaned back slightly in my chair, trying to steady my thoughts. And where does that leave me? I asked. Ethan's gaze finally softened, but only slightly, like a controlled adjustment rather than an emotional shift. It leaves you exactly where you have always been, he said. Inside the framework of what we created. I felt something inside me tighten at those words. Not anger, not fear. Something more disorienting. The sense that my life had never fully exited the structure I thought I had escaped. The room was quiet again after that, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with everything that had not yet been said, everything that was still being decided, and everything I was beginning to understand I might not be able to step outside of so easily. I did not speak immediately after Ethan Blake finished talking. The silence that followed his words felt heavier than anything I had experienced so far. Not because it was empty, but because it felt deliberately placed there, as if even silence inside this room had structure and intention. Inside the framework of what we created, he had said. That sentence kept repeating in my mind, not as emotion but as definition. I looked down at the table between us, trying to understand how something I thought I had left behind could still be described as something I was inside of. The word framework made it sound stable, architectural, something designed to hold weight. But I had never agreed to be part of it. I finally spoke, my voice quieter than I expected. You are speaking as if I agreed to any of this, I said. Ethan did not react immediately. His gaze remained steady, not defensive, not dismissive, simply focused. Agreement is not always the point, he replied. That answer should have made me angry. Instead, it made me feel disoriented, because it implied that my choices had never been the only factor shaping my life. I leaned forward slightly, my hands resting on the edge of the table. Then what is the point? I asked. If I was never given a choice. There was a pause before he answered, longer this time. When he spoke, his tone was still controlled, but there was something different underneath it, something closer to finality. The point, he said, is stability. For you. For Noah. For what comes after. Hearing my son's name in that context made something inside me tighten in a way I could not ignore. Not fear exactly. Something more primal. Protective. You do not get to define stability for us, I said quietly. Ethan's expression shifted slightly, not into disagreement, but into something more complicated, like he was measuring how much truth I was ready to absorb at once. I am not defining it alone, he said. I am maintaining what was already set in motion. I looked at him for a long moment, searching for any crack in his certainty, any hesitation that would suggest uncertainty or emotional conflict. There was none that I could see. That absence itself became the most unsettling part of the conversation. I realized then that I had been expecting emotional collapse or regret, something human enough to argue against. Instead, I was facing structure. A system of reasoning that did not rely on feelings to justify itself. I sat back slowly, my thoughts no longer moving in straight lines. You are treating my life like it belongs inside a design, I said. Ethan's voice lowered slightly. Your life has always existed inside systems, he replied. You are only now seeing the shape of them. I almost laughed, but it did not come out. Because somewhere beneath my resistance, I could feel something uncomfortable forming. Recognition, not of his control, but of patterns I had never fully questioned before. The timing of my job loss, the speed of decisions that followed my departure, The way every step forward since leaving had been met with something already in place to guide or contain it. I stood up slowly, not because the conversation had ended, but because I needed distance from it. Ethan did not stop me. He only watched as I moved toward the door. Before I left, I turned back once. "If everything you are saying is true," I said, "then what happens now?" For the first time since I entered the room, something in his expression shifted slightly. Not uncertainty, not doubt, but acknowledgement. "Now," he said, "you decide whether you want to remain outside the system or understand what your place inside it actually means." I left the room without responding. The hallway outside felt too long, too quiet, as if it had been waiting for that exact moment to exist. And as I stepped into the elevator, one thought followed me down through every floor. If my life had never truly been outside his framework, then leaving him had never been an ending. It had only been the point where I started to see it.